Well, the birds are coming home to roost. Well, not the chickens in this case, but really this is called the death warrant for American ingenuity. Great article that was in this week's newsletter. Well, I hate to say this, but in reality, we are looking at some very, very bad times for inventors. And I've had some of these problems myself before, but last September, there were scores of patent holders who demonstrated in 6 cities across the U.S. They had on these black T-shirts that said, Homo sapiens inventoris, endangered species. They were protesting America's decade of stolen dreams. Great article here in the American Thinker. It was in my newsletter this week. But here's really what happened here. Back in 2011, President Obama pushed through Congress and signed into law what they called the America Invents Act. Now, just like the Inflation Reduction Act is going to increase inflation, right? It's all doublespeak, isn't it? The America Invents Act turned over the patent process basically to the biggest Democrat Party donors. Big business, billionaires, right? Because that's who really is funding them. The Hollywood millionaires, these massive billionaires, Zuckerbergs and others. And what happened here is they changed the whole patent law and the basis for it. They flipped the table here, basically. Here's the idea behind the patent law that we've had in place in the United States for well over a century, and patents that are guaranteed in the Constitution. It used to be that if you were first to invent something, if you could show that you were first to invent something, you could file a patent and gain that patent. Well, what happened is, because of all of the donations that went into the Democrats in 2011 from these big companies that were lobbying them, and this is part of the reason I have a huge problem with all this money going to Washington, D.C., frankly, because it just attracts rodents like these big companies that want to use the law to control you, to gain profit for them, and really, in this case, squash potential patent holders. You see, there have been piracy for years in the patent field, and this happened to me. I spent a year of my life designing some software, writing some software that emulated an older computer system and allowed you to take any of that software and run it on the new system, and it would run exactly the same way. And a lease on the new hardware was cheaper than just a maintenance contract on the old stuff. Plus, it was faster, used less electricity, had more options, etc. Right? It was really something, frankly. And I was invited to their headquarters to show them a little bit about what it did. And I was so excited because they wanted to start selling it, right? So that you'd understand a little bit better. So I went to the headquarters and met with them. Of course, paid my own way, flew down there, stayed in a hotel, rented a car, all the stuff that you have to do. And then nothing happened afterwards. They wouldn't return phone calls. It just all of a sudden went silent. And then about a year and a half later, Tata, they had an alternative product out on the market. Yeah. And they tried to emulate what I had done, but they did a very, very poor job at it. That's patent theft. That's piracy in this particular case. If you're an inventor, you've probably experienced that sort of thing before. You can put in place all of the non-disclosure agreements you want to have in place, but in reality, good luck enforcing those, especially against a big company. Well, piracy went on steroids because of President Obama's America Invents Act. They, as part of that, established something they called the Patent Trial and Appeal Board. And it's just gone downhill ever since. So a professor that has more than 40 patents, I'm going to read a little quote of his. This includes some inventions used in the space shuttles, by the way, which, by the way, my invention was used with the space shuttle. So Dan Brown invented something called the bionic wrench. I have one of those. I bought one of those some years back. This is a one-size-fits-all wrench that does not strip bolt corners like it does if you're trying to use vice grips or some pair of pliers, right? Because you're just too lazy to go and get the right socket size or box wrench or whatever it is that's the right size. It's very, very cool. And Professor Brown says that Sears stole his idea for this bionic wrench, right down to the marketing pitch. And then Sears, according to him, went out and hired a Chinese company to make it. And all of a sudden now, what kind of invention does he have? How's he going to battle somebody like that? I know a guy who is completely unethical. You know, I've done many shows from the Consumer Electronics Show, and it's really kind of cool because I would get in depth with the inventors and explain what they were doing on the air. It was really neat all the way around. It was just a whole lot of fun. And I met a guy there who was going to the Consumer Electronics Show to find cool, new consumer electronics he thought might be popular. And then he'd go and talk to the people who were exhibiting that wonderful new electronics and say, hey, I'm interested in selling your stuff. I have, retail space and, kiosks in the mall. What kind of deal can we work out here? Well, first, I need a copy of your device here. I want a copy of it so I can mess with it and see if we really want to follow through on this. Oh, and I don't want to carry it around the floor of the Consumer Electronics Show, so I need you to ship it to me. So they'd ship them off. They might be a little speaker. They might be a charger. They might be who knows what. Consumer electronics is pretty broad. And if he liked it, he wouldn't buy it from them. He sent them over to his contacts in China and had them reverse engineer it and make the same thing with his brand label on it. And he'd sell it in the stores. Now, when it comes to software and a lot of consumer electronics, patents aren't really a big deal because things change so quickly, right? And if you're a small guy, it's very hard to file a patent. And that's how President Obama sold this American Invents Act to us. I remember this very, very clearly, where he said, hey, listen, this is going to make the patent process way more streamlined, way easier for the small guys to be able to get patents not only applied for, but actually get them out to market. And it's just going to be an absolutely wonderful thing. It isn't. Because what happens now is big companies are not investing in research and development. That is true across the board. Now you might say, hey, Craig, well, how about big companies? How about Tesla? That's R&D. How about SpaceX? That's R&D. Yes, but they are R&D companies. They're not big companies out there like Facebook. Does Facebook try and come up with this or that new invention? Well, yeah, they kind of do from time to time. But most of the time, what's been happening is corporate America looks for a winner and then tries to buy the winner. Microsoft has been doing that forever. Microsoft in court has lost cases because of what they did to inventors. And now it's been codified in law for over 10 years. So our American ingenuity, which is what we rely on in order to grow our economy, the ingenuity, the brain skills, the science, the true science that we have, gives us a major competitive advantage because that particular type of intellectual property has a much higher profit margin than something like manufacturing a widget. When you get right down to it, that's where the real money is. So a very interesting article, and I would suggest you take a little bit of time to read it if you've ever thought about patenting something, if you had a great idea. It used to be, this is kind of the old wives' tale, if you will. If you've got a great idea, you think you might want to patent it, write it all out, take all of your notes, do it in a workbook that you can't alter, right? You can't tear out pages or things, mail it to yourself in a manila envelope and make sure you put stamps on it, and then the post office is going to date stamp it for you, or send it to your attorney, even better, right? And your attorney is going to go ahead and keep that on file. And then when it's time to file the patent, you can say, hey, look, here's the proof. I invented this in April of 2019. Doesn't matter. Because if some other company sees what you're doing or comes up with a similar or the same idea, and that company has the money and to have the lawyers that know patent law inside out and backwards and can go ahead and file that patent claim, you've lost it. As early as the Constitutional Convention of 1787, our founding fathers recognized the need to promote innovation. And we have to be promoting it. We've got to get rid of this Obama-era law. Absolutely. We've got to go from first to file, which is what it has been for a decade. The first person to file, you got it! And move back to the way it was intended, the way it worked for well over 100 years, where it is a first to invent. It's very, very important for all of us, for economy, etc. The third law of Congress was the Patent Act of 1790. It's just, man, have we come a long way. Stick around. We'll be right back online, CraigPeterson.com. We've had firewalls in our cars for a very long time, for a very good reason, right? You want to keep the engine stuff out of the passenger compartment. The same thing is true when we're talking about our networks. We're using firewalls to keep things out. Firewalls are there to keep things out, and we have firewalls in our homes. If you've got an internet service provider, you've probably got a firewall right there, something that you don't even think about, right? It's just there. It's going to protect you. It's providing some services. You might be familiar with them. It's obviously doing a network address translation for you. In this day and age, pretty much everything is, especially with the internet transition that's been going on for years now from IP4 to IP6. But the firewall is critical for every person and every business out there. But when we get into the configurations of firewalls, frankly, they are really a touchy subject. Every network security professional has their own preferred hardware and software. I use Cisco as a rule. Cisco has some great stuff. What I like the best about the Cisco equipment that we use and software and install at our clients is it is one pane of glass. It's a single vendor that covers everything from endpoint security, in other words, security on your desktop, through the network itself, the switches, the firewalls, the email filters, absolutely everything is there and is taken care of by all of the Cisco gear. It's really quite something to look at. I saw, in fact, a survey just last week at businesses who are trying to consolidate. There's just too many vendors in there selling this piece of endpoint, that piece of endpoint. And, that's part of the problem that I see happen pretty frequently, which is people look at Gartner reports. Gartner, of course, a research company. They've got a lot of great research out there that I've used before. I've had Gartner on the radio show before, as well as some of their competitors talking about trends. Well, there is something known as the upper right quadrant in those Gartner reports, where they are rating various vendors for various pieces of software. So there might be, for instance, a report on firewalls, and the upper right-hand quadrant is kind of what you want because it's new, it's innovative, it's really cool and wonderful, and it's the best thing since sliced bread. So they go out and they buy that because it's upper right Gartner quadrant. And then, man, they find out, okay, so now we need a desktop. Okay, so they find buy the Gartner report for $5 to $10,000 that's like a page long. It's crazy how expensive these things are. And they then look at that and say, okay, so the best desktop is vendor Y. So let me see, we got X for the firewall, we got Y for the endpoint. And then, they need switches. So let's go to the Gartner report. Who's in the upper right quadrant here for switches? Oh, it's vendor Z. Okay, so we got Z. So now all of a sudden, you end up with all of these different pieces of hardware, different pieces of software that have limited interoperability at best, right? So this day and age, when we're talking about cybersecurity, there are so many legitimate attacks every day. I mean, thousands of attacks going on, even against a single business. And there are hundreds, potentially, of false alarms every day. So how do you deal with that? That's a good question. So a lot of businesses turn to companies like mine. Now, full disclosure, I've been doing internet security work for businesses since early 1990s, so 30 years now. And I've been doing internet work for even longer than that, helping to develop it. So they'll go and they'll say, hey, we need a managed security services provider. There's a big problem with that. And I was watching Yellowstone, that TV show, and it was a great little example of what we're seeing in the world today. And frankly, we've seen forever, obviously. And that is, if there is a demand for something, all of a sudden, a lot of people will be hanging up shingles. And if if that vendor knows more than you do, or is able to kind of twist your ear and convince you to buy from them, you'll buy from them. We saw that, around the year 2000, all of the people who were trying to sell web services that had no idea what they're doing. Now we're seeing all kinds of people trying to sell network services, security services that have little idea of what they're doing. We support these companies that call themselves managed security services providers, where we actually go in, we design the system, we build the system, and we implement the system, we run the system. And the third party here bills the client, right? Because it's their client. And, that's all fine, it's all well and good. But what should you be looking for, particularly if you're a business, if you want to have a managed firewall, which is, I think, important? Again, it's kind of a long-tail thing to have a firewall vendor and this vendor and a managed vendor. And, it can get to be a headache pretty quickly. But if you're going to focus on one thing, it's probably the firewall and your endpoints, right? So maybe it's two things. So here's what a managed firewall service provider should be able to offer you. First of all, firewall system health and alerting, software lifecycle management, which means your updates, your patches, service and incident management. Whenever there's an alarm, they should know about it and they should be handling it. Security policy implementation, your reporting, your analysis, your remediation. Some of that is required by these various regulations and laws that are out there. You have to do it, without getting into a lot of detail right now. Network monitoring, the traffic monitoring. The idea here behind any kind of managed service is to bring in a true expert rather than just completely outsourcing. So you're partnering with someone. One of the things I've batted my head against the wall for decades now is that the IT department thinks that they're up to snuff to be able to do something, or maybe they just want to do it because it's going to be wonderful for them on the resume for the next job, right? I've seen that a lot of times. When you're looking at all of this stuff and you've got an IT department, maybe you're better off bringing in a very narrow expert to support your IT department rather than fight against your IT department. Good questions here. Bottom line, they should have better expertise than what you have, and you've got to read between the lines between your IT staff that are currently doing it and the other vendors, reducing the burden on your staff so that maybe what they can do is focus more on things that are revenue generating, that are more important to your business. You'll get faster incident response with any luck here with service level agreements, proactive security from the managed security services providers or just regular service providers. Your burden on updates is going to be lower, improved manufacturer support, because a lot of times, like we do, my company, Mainstream, we have direct connections to the manufacturer. In our case, it's usually Cisco, because of the volume of services that we have and the equipment that we buy from them. Easier to scale. There's a whole bunch of things, right? But be careful. One of the things you got to watch out for, too, is where are their service people, their support people physically located, and are they U.S. citizens? A lot of the regulations, in fact, pretty much I can't think of an exception, require U.S. persons to be the ones in control of your network and data. So lots to consider here. But keep that all in mind. I think it's an important thing to understand. Stick around. We'll be right back. And in the meantime, visit me online, craigpeterson.com, and sign up for my free newsletter. The best way to secure a system is something you know and something you have. Well, many systems have been securing themselves with your phone, right? They send you a text message. But it turns out that isn't working well. Having an SMS message sent to you in order to authenticate who you are has turned out to be, a problem. We've seen over the last few years people who have things like cryptocurrency, who have a cryptocurrency wallet, who are keeping their money, if you will, in this wallet, and are using SMS to verify who they are. So here's how that works. You log into a website using a username or perhaps an email address. Again, it should not be asking for an email address for a login because you probably use the same email address or maybe 2 or 3 and have 50, 100 different sites, maybe 1,000. I've got 3,000 records, logins on my 1Password account. Okay, so there's a lot of them. They really should be letting you set up your own username so that it can be unique for every single website that you go to. So anyways, that aside, you've got your username, which may be your email address. You've got a password. We've talked about passwords before. Hopefully you're following the current guidelines, which are don't worry about random characters. Make sure it is long, and that means best a passphrase. So you string 3 or 4 words together, you put some digits, some special characters in between the words. Maybe, one word is all uppercase. You play with it a little bit, but it's easy to remember. So if someone then gets your email address and they get your password, they can potentially log into a website, correct? And that website might be your bank account. It might be your work account. We've had a lot of problems lately. The FBI is saying that about every 12 hours, they're filing a new report of a company that got their intellectual property stolen. One of the ways the bad guys steal it is they'll log into your RDP server, your Microsoft Remote Desktop server, using your credentials that you used at another website. It's that easy. It really is. They might be trying to log in via a VPN. Again, the same thing. So how do you secure this? How do you secure this well? How to secure this properly? That's where the something you have comes into play. We all have a smartphone of some sort. Even if it's not considered a smartphone, it can still receive text messages. So what a lot of these companies did is they asked their underpaid IT people to set it up so that when you enter in your username and your password, it then sends you a text message, usually with a 6-digit text message, and you then have to type that into the website as well. Seems pretty good, doesn't it? Well, and in theory, it is pretty good. There are, however, a few problems. Those people I mentioned who have cryptocurrency accounts and have been using this SMS methodology, which is SMS, of course, text messages, have found that sometimes their phones have been hijacked. Easy enough to do. And if they know you have a fair amount of cryptocurrency, it's probably worth their effort to spend a few hours to try and get into your account. And they have been getting into your account. And people notice, hey, wait a minute, I'm not getting any phone calls or text messages. What's with that? And you found out that they have smished you. They have stolen your SIM card, basically, even though they don't have to physically have hold of it. And there's a number of ways that they do that. There's a new scam or newer scam that's out right now that the phishers are using, and that is they're sending out these SMS, these text messages that are trying to get people to respond. So how do they get people to respond? Well, in this case, they're primarily going after this company called Octopost. And there's a number of different types of Octos out there. But anyways, they are trying to get you to do something you shouldn't do. Let me just put it that way, right? So what they're trying to do is get you to enter in your username and your password. Okay, well, that's been around for a long time, Craig, you're telling me. We've had fake bank account, bank websites, so they'll send you an email. And in it, they'll say, hey, I need you to go right now to our bank page and authorize this $2,000 transaction that wasn't you. And so now you're freaking out. You click on the link, you go to the bank, you try and log in, and the login doesn't work. Well, that can be because what the phishers did is they made a web page that looked like the bank's web page. And when you went there and entered in your username and password, you just gave it to the crooks. That's happened a lot. Well, there's a company called Okta, O-K-T-A, that is an authentication company. And what the bad guys have done is they have registered domains similar to a company. So, for instance, they went after Cloudflare, which is a huge company. They're number one. I think they have like 80% of all of the protection for denial of service and caching a business on the internet. It's just amazing. Cloudflare is huge, and I've used them and continue to use them for some customers. So what they did is they found a whole bunch of people that work for Cloudflare, sent them a message, and here's what it said. It said, alert, your Cloudflare schedule has been updated. Please tap cloudflare-okta.com to view the changes. So you go there, it looks like a regular Okta login page, and they go ahead and ask username and password. But Cloudflare is smart. They're using Okta. So they're sending an SMS message to the user to make sure it's really them. Turns out what was really happening is, it was sending that guy a text message, and it was using Telegram to relay his response back to the hackers. So now the hackers have your username, they have your password, and they have your 6-digit login key that's supposedly unique, that supposedly went to you. And in this case, they didn't even have to bother hijacking your SIM card. In this case, they just sent you that text message. So it's been causing some serious problems. They've been going after all kinds of different companies out there. Food service company DoorDash, you've heard of them, right? August 25th, they said that there was a sophisticated phishing attack on a third-party vendor that allowed attackers to gain access to some of DoorDash's internal company tools. DoorDash said intruders stole information on a small percentage of users that have since been notified. Big deal or what? TechCrunch, by the way, reported that the incident was linked to the same phishing campaign that targeted Twilio, that also, as we just mentioned, targeted Cloudflare. So we have to be careful with this. We cannot be using SMS text messages to authenticate ourselves. Some banks now allow you to use one-time passwords from things like 1Password or others. However, some banks don't turn off the SMS, the text messages for authentication, which they really should be doing. And the other thing I want to let you know is I like YubiKey. YUBICO.com, Yubico. Check them out. I'm not making a dime off of this, but they have a physical token that you either have to plug in or that connects via Bluetooth. That is something you have that'll authenticate you to all major popular websites out there and many of the tools. So if you have any questions, just email me, me@craigpeterson.com. Give me a few days, but I'll get back to you. Have you heard about fog reveal? It's almost invisible when you search for it online, but it's something that police departments have started using, and they're trying to keep all of this secret. So we're going to tell you what's happening there and got a few others too. Great little article that was in the newsletter this week. Hopefully you got my free newsletter, but it is about fog reveal. This is in Ars Technica. Often some of these Ars Technica stories are carried in multiple places online. It's kind of interesting because we know to some degree what the federal government's doing to collect information on people. They go to open source sources of information, in other words, things that are put out there publicly online. So they might search your Facebook information or what you've been saying on Twitter or more. They go to data brokers that anybody can go to. And those data brokers have more information. They've probably bought records from the states, and they know from each individual state what property you own, if you have a car, if there's liens on it, any mortgages that you might have, right? Putting all of this stuff together. It's kind of an interesting problem, frankly. But that's again, they say it's legitimate. Now, the federal government is not allowed to collect this information, so they just go to third-party data aggregators. And remember, again, if you have apps on your phone, if you have an Android phone, this does not apply to iPhones generally. It does apply to iPhone apps, however. And this is part of the reason I say never, ever, ever use Android. Okay, guys? It just blows my mind. I was talking to an old friend of mine. He was the CTO, in fact, for the state of New Hampshire. And he was telling me that, we were talking and he's telling me, I got an Android phone. He says, don't you just love Android? And he knows that I do cybersecurity. He knows I've been in IT. He hired my company to do a bunch of different tasks for the state, right, over the years. We still do business with the state. And he's using Android. He's probably listening right now. I'm probably going to get a little note from him. But it's a problem to use Android. Anyhow, those free apps that you're using, that Google Maps app that you're using, and of course you can use that on iOS as well, is tracking you. They know where you live because they know where your smartphone stays at night. They know all of this stuff. How do you think the FBI is able to seize a smartphone at a Hardee's drive-thru? They know where you are. Well, they have some more access to information, as it turns out. One Maryland-based sergeant, according to the article, wrote in a department email touting the benefit of, quote, no court paperwork, end quote, before purchasing the software. And the sergeant said the success lies in secrecy. Interesting. So the Electronic Frontier Foundation, EFF, who I have supported over the years, and the Associated Press got together. Now, the Associated Press won a Pulitzer Center for Crisis Reporting award, I think. But anyways, the Pulitzer Center for Crisis Reporting also got involved here. So you had these three different organizations trying to figure out what could or what would be considered local police's best kept secret. So they went online, they started doing some searching, trying to figure this out. And according to Ars Technica, the reporting revealed the potentially extreme extent of data surveillance of ordinary people being tracked and made vulnerable just for moving about small town America. So it isn't just the big cities where you're tracked anymore. Reports showed how police, nearly 24 agencies, one record shows the total figure could possibly be up to 60, use Google Maps-like technology called Frog Reveal. Now, this is licensed by Fog. I keep saying Frog, it's Fog. Licensed by Fog Data Science. And it gives state and local police a power to surveil hundreds of billions of records from 250 million mobile devices. If that doesn't scare you, I don't know what does. Now, EFF, the Electronic Frontier Foundation, found that Fog Reveal gets its data from Ventel. That's the same data source the feds use. Neither companies disclosing the nature of their business relationship, okay? The Fog Reveal didn't say what Ventel is providing and vice versa, right? Yeah. But it really appears that Fog Reveal is getting data location services to local police at a steep discount. So it's making it more affordable for smaller police departments and private security companies to access major amounts of data and trace devices across months or even years. Isn't that something? So typically, EFF found that police agencies license the software annually for costs as low as $6,000 to $9,000. Some agencies spend even more on this tech to track people as they are moving and exactly where they are. Again, think being in a Hardee's drive-thru, having the FBI show up, knowing you're there. Ours reviewed one annual contract in Anaheim, California that was for more than $40,000. So it took months for these three organizations that are used to digging into this sort of stuff to figure this out. It took more than 100 public records requests to gather thousands of pages of evidence, to trying to compile a picture of how local law enforcement is using and mining the location data. Now, to me, this is scary because we look at abuses of power through the years. And it's happened again and again and again. We're smelling more and more like Venezuela than we are free U.S. It's frankly scary to me. But I'm talking about it because I think it's important that I bring this to light to everybody else out there, okay? Now, Fog Data Science Managing Partner Matthew Broderick told the Associated Press that Fog Reveal has been critical to police to save time and money on investigations, suggesting police were under-resourced and investigations suffered from reliance on outdated tech. Now, that's true, isn't it? But isn't it also true that that's why we have some of these policies and procedures in place? That's why the Supreme Court Miranda decision has some policies and procedures. That's why a search warrant is supposed to be specific in what they're looking for and where it is located. We don't allow these broad warrants that the king used to issue, but we are doing that nowadays. It seems against political enemies. And that's where it starts really, really scaring me. It isn't that I think that the current administration or even the next administration in Washington, D.C. is going to be rounding up its enemies and putting them up against a wall. But when would it happen? Well, it would happen if everything were in place for it to happen. What's one of the most important things for a fascist regime? It's to have a citizenry where they know everything about everyone. It reminds me of the Soviet era. Show me the man, I'll show you the crime. There's a great book out there right now. I think it's called 3 Felonies a Day, I think is what the name of it is. But it points out how every last one of the people that call ourselves Americans in the United States of America, every one of us commits at least 3 felonies a day. Now, a lot of these things are just absolutely crazy. You know, there's been a lot of jokes about, oh, did you tear the label off of that pillow? Well, you can, because you're the consumer, right? It's the people that are selling it, that are in distribution chain, that cannot tear that off by law, okay? But in reality, there is a lot of stuff that could be used against you. So it's like when they say, give me this, or why don't you answer that question? It's none of their business. You have a right to be secure in your papers, right? Now, if they have a warrant that's specific, then you need to surrender it. But hopefully the warrant's actually issued by real court. Some of these agencies now, like the IRS, have their own courts that are paid for by the agency. The judges are working for the agency. So you really think they're going to be fair? I wonder. Okay, a couple more things here. Next up, these pictures taken by the James Webb Space Telescope. Have you seen these? It is amazing. I've seen them side by side with our previous high-tech pictures. And we're seeing what may be galaxies that we never could see before. It's just absolutely crazy. Well, guess what? Bad guys have seen them as well. And they are embedding malware inside of some of these amazing images taken by the James Webb Space Telescope, if you can believe this. By the way, they're writing them in Go. So phishing emails, they've got a Microsoft Office attachment. That's the entry point for the attack chain. When you open it, it retrieves an obfuscated VBA macro, which in turn auto-executed. All of a sudden, there is a macro that is de-obfuscated and run on your computer. So be careful. Careful with that again. And good news, Microsoft is now turning off the execution of macros by default. Double check your machine, making sure the macros are blocked by default. So yay, okay? So they are, by the way, changing campaigns to rogue link and ISO files because of the blocked macros. But it's good that Microsoft is doing that, thank goodness. And Ukraine, the police busted a crypto fraud call center. In fact, more than one. And they're also shuttering 2 more Russian bot farms. So we shouldn't be getting as many of those phone messages from the bad guys, scammers, as we used to get. Thank you, Ukraine. All right, online, CraigPeterson.com. Get that newsletter and stay on top. Well, we got some election news here from our friends at Google and at Twitter. They are taking opposite directions about exactly how they're going to handle news postings about the elections. This is an interesting thing. The Federal Election Commission is the branch of the U.S. government that monitors elections. It does things like impose fines for misuse of funds. It sets some of the standards for funds and for their use. And one of the things it looks at is what are called in-kind contributions. This is where someone might, for instance, run a whole bunch of ads on behalf of a candidate, and those ads are coordinated with the campaign, and that is illegal. You're not supposed to do that. And because it's illegal, they try and stop it, but most of the time they end up fining after the fact. And that's part of the reason they want campaigns to be filing their financial reports fairly frequently, so they can catch it quite quickly. Well, there have been many complaints from the GOP about what has happened with some of the campaign finance stuff, where you have someone like Facebook or Twitter or Google who seems to be meddling with the election. They are running ads for your competition. They are really screening the results from people's searches, and from those results, they're benefiting. There was a study down in Orange County here a few years back where they looked at Google results that were related to the elections going on in Orange County and found that the Google results were tainted in such a way that it dramatically favored the Democrats that were running in those districts in Orange County, California. Pretty interesting when you get right down to it. So the GOP says, wait a minute now, that sort of thing is worth millions, tens of millions of dollars. Because if they were going to run TV ads, for instance, to get as many eyeballs, to get as much attention, to convince people that this is the way they should vote, that would cost them tens of millions of dollars. So how much is it worth? Where do you go to really straighten things out in order to ultimately make fairness work? And, well, that's kind of what the Federal Election Commission's supposed to do. Well, here's what's happening with the next elections. The Federal Elections Commission has decided that Google getting rid of their anti-spam measures for candidates does not violate a ban on contributions, on in-kind contributions. So this is an interesting approach because Google's saying, hey, listen, we want to allow pretty much any political message to come right through to Google Gmail users' inboxes and not filter those, which I frankly think is a smart move on their part. Now, some of these campaigns get pretty crazy. They're sending money requests all of the time. It's been crazy to watch. Both sides do this, and both sides complain about the other side doing it. But at least by getting rid of these spam rules for the politicians, their messages are going to get through. I think that's ultimately a very good thing. So what kind of messages are going to get through? How and why? Well, ultimately, they're saying we're going to let all of them through. And what that means for you, if you already get some of these messages from the politicians, it means your mailbox, at least if it's a Google Gmail box, you are going to be seeing even more during elections. And I think this is going to go on for a very long time because Google doesn't want to get caught in the middle. When we're talking about these in-kind contributions, if this were to be done for the Republicans or were to be done just for the Democrats, can you imagine the noise that would be made? Yeah, by both sides. And in-kind contributions for the Republicans, tens of millions of dollars, Google would get all tied up in some of these, lawsuits that would really be inevitable, bottom line. Well, Republicans have accused Google of giving Democrats an advantage in its algorithms. And as I said, there have been studies on that have proved that they have. The big question is why. And there's an article in Ars Technica talking about a meeting that happened in May 2022 between Senate Republicans and Google's chief legal officer. And he said that the most forceful rebuke came from Senator Marco Rubio from Florida, who claimed that not a single email from one of his addresses was reaching inboxes. And the Washington Post, which of course is a mouthpiece for the Democrat Party, reported in late July that the reason it was getting blocked was that a vendor had not enabled an authentication tool that keeps messages from being marked as spam. Now, if that's true, the Washington Post accidentally reported the truth here. And it might be true. I had a company call me up this week. They had their Google Ads account banned. And they were trying to figure out the details of why and what happened. And I went in and we solved that problem. And I noticed that they had not properly configured their email. There's gets technical here. I have a paper we've put together on this, a special report talking about what's called DKIM, these SPF records, DMARC records, and how they should all be set up and why you need to use them. So this company was doing marketing, obviously. They had a Google ad account. They were sending out emails. But because they had not properly and fully configured their email, they were not getting delivered at the rate that they could get delivered. Now, that's kind of a very, very big deal when you get right down to it. And the Washington Post is saying, well, that's what happened to Senator Rubio. Now, there's other things that might happen, too. There are keywords that are used. There's software called Spam Assassin that's very, very common. I have used it since it came out decades ago. I can't even remember how long Spam Assassin's been out there. But it looks for certain things in the emails. It looks for a lot of graphical content, a lot of HTML, even a lot of links, and it gauges, this is likely spam on this scale. And typically, if the score is higher than 5 or 8, or in some cases, some people said as high as 15, that email is bounced. Well, one of the real big checks as to whether or not this is legitimate email is to check and see, well, who is the domain? Does that domain have these special keys that tell us, yes, indeed, this did come from us? In other words, in this case, it did come from Marco Rubio, or in the case of my client, it came from their company.com. And is it signed, encrypted, so that we know that nobody's kind of playing a man-in-the-middle thing, trying to mess things up on us? And they say, okay, well, that's a really good score, so we'll lower that spam score. And that's how that game is played. So by Google doing what it's talking about doing, it's really going to help out, because I have, of every company I've checked for email deliveries, we've got a new customer that is a startup. And, what do they know? They're very narrow, right? They understand their basic technology, and their email, again, was set up kind of like apparently Senator Rubio's email was set up and didn't have these things. And just like this company that I helped this week, they didn't have it set up properly. And they had experts supposed experts who had set it up. In both cases, right, it was outsourced. But, yeah, you know how that goes. Now, some Gmail users submitted comments to the Federal Elections Commission, and they were criticizing Google's plan because they did not want to get more spam, okay? And there were more than 2,500 comments. You can find them, by the way, online. All of this stuff is a matter of public record, and they call it the docket. And so there's a page for this particular docket. And the commission's 3 Republicans and Democrat commissioner voted for the order approving Google's plan. I think this is a very, very good deal. And it's really kind of the opposite of what Twitter is planning on doing. Twitter has essentially announced that it's going to meddle in the elections. Yeah, so you got Google on the one side saying, our hands are clean, we're staying away from this, we don't want anything to do with this, thank you very much, we love you, but forget about it. We're just going to let all the emails through. Twitter is saying that it's going to have its wonderful censors, who have been proven right every time, he said with his tongue firmly planted in his cheek. And they're going to have those wonderful censors that, they're sitting in the basement and eating pizza and drinking Coke or Red Bull. I still can't understand why somebody that's 30 whatever years old needs energy drinks. Come on. But anyways, they're saying that Twitter is going to be the determiner as to whether or not something that is posted on Twitter is correct, or if it should be censored, or if it should be blocked entirely. And they're admitting that they're going to shadow ban conservative content they don't like. Isn't that something? Yeah, that's from the Gateway Pundit. Good article, and you'll find it in this week's newsletter. I think it went out Monday this week, and you can follow the link through to these articles on Google and Twitter and the elections, or any of the others that we have out there. So stick around. We'll be right back, and make sure you sign up if you didn't already. Get that newsletter absolutely free. CraigPeterson.com/subscribe. I'm not sure a week goes by where I don't hear from a listener saying that somehow Facebook is tracking what they're talking about, because all of a sudden ads start showing up and they're related to things that they've been talking about. Meta is the owner of Facebook and Instagram and some other things like WhatsApp, which is part of the reason I don't trust WhatsApp. But we've had, I don't know how many complaints from people saying that Facebook is listening in to what they're talking about. And people are kind of wondering, well, wait a minute, is it listening in on my phone calls? Is it listening when and how? It's a very, very good question. Now, Facebook says in a statement that Facebook does not use your phone's microphone to inform ads or to change what you see in the news feed. Some recent articles have suggested that we must be listening to people's conversations in order to show them relevant ads. This is not true. We show ads based on people's interests and other profile information, not what you're talking out loud about. We only access your microphone if you've given our app permission and if you are actively using a specific feature that requires audio. This might include recording a video or using an optional feature we introduced 2 years ago to include music or other audio in your status updates. So there it is. There's the official word from our friends over at Facebook. But do you notice there's a little bit of an out in there? Right? Facebook does not use your phone's microphone to inform ads or change what you see in your news feed. Doesn't use your microphone. So there's a study out right now that is from an ex-Google engineer, and this article is in The Guardian, and they are talking about what he found. So let me explain the background on some of this technology first. If you are an app developer, if you're a developer of any software of any kind, you use libraries. And these libraries do things like search for a specific set of characters called a string, or insert them, or move things around, or open a connection to another machine. So rather than having to implement the whole TCP/IP stack and Ethernet underneath it, and all of the operating system work that you'd have to do with all of the interrupts and the buffer fills and reading and toggling switches in the hardware, doing all of that sort of stuff, you just make one library call and say, listen, and you give the port, and ta-da, anybody who tries to connect to you, it just comes right through. It's all taken care of for you, right? That's what libraries are all about. And they've become much more complex more recently. Libraries nowadays can do things like provide you with a full web browser. Many of the applications that we use on a daily basis, these apps in our phones particularly, but it's also true with some of the apps on our computers, are actually just web browsers. They're web browsers that talk to a server out on the internet. And yeah, they might be wrapped in various things, but oftentimes if you're trying to pay within an app, it'll go to a third-party site. And part of the beauty of that is it becomes a service to them. They don't have to worry about coding it all up, right? They don't have to worry about taking your money, keeping everything safe. Am I using really good algorithms here to encrypt it? Can bad guys hack in? No. They're just calling this routine that spins up a little web browser, inside the application and uses a secure connection to talk to the web server somewhere. Who cares? Not mine. I'm just the app developer, right? I'm letting you play your farming game or whatever it might be. That makes sense to you guys? So it makes their life much, much easier. Why bother if you've got a website that does everything? Why bother coding it all up from scratch in an app? They don't. People don't. Why would they? Well, we've seen that again and again. For instance, look at Microsoft's latest browser out there, Edge. Not the original Edge, but the latest Edge. You know how Microsoft is, right? They call it the same thing, even though it's entirely different. How many versions of Windows were there? Like 20 at one point, right? Different ones for different architectures, and just crazy. But now the Edge browser is built on Chromium, which is Google Chrome, which is built on Apple's libraries to manipulate, draw things, etc. So you're running your Edge browser on your Microsoft Windows computer. You're actually running code libraries, if you will, from Google and from Apple. And that way, if you're developing a browser like Edge, you don't have to worry about every little nitty thing. That's all taken care of by other programmers who are making a smaller piece of code. Now, that's been the whole Unix philosophy forever, by the way. Instead of having these monolithic applications that could be just full of bugs and security problems, you just have nice, small, easy to maintain, easy to research applications and let other people worry about the little pieces, which is really kind of cool. It's great. Many browsers, in fact, are based right there on Chromium, and they modify it around a little bit. Microsoft added all kinds of spyware to it. Well, it turns out, according to this research from an ex-Google engineer, that both Facebook and Instagram apps have been taking advantage of this in-app browser technology. And what they're doing is users who click on links inside the Facebook app or inside the Instagram app are actually taken to the web pages using an in-app browser controlled by Facebook or Instagram, rather than sending you to your default browser. So if you're using iOS, your default browser might be Safari, which is a rather safe browser and good for privacy. Or you might have decided you want to use the Chrome browser on iOS, or maybe Firefox or Brave, or one of dozens of different browsers that are out there. No, it's not going to use those. It's not going to use your default browser. It's going to use the in-app browser. And what it's doing with that in-app browser now is, here's a quote from him, Felix Krauss. He's a privacy researcher who founded an app development tool that was acquired by Google in 2017. He says, quote, "The Instagram app injects their tracking code into every website shown, including when clicking on ads, enabling them to monitor all user interactions, like every button that you press, every link you tap, every piece of text that you select or highlight, any screenshots you take, any forms you fill out, any user forms, things like passwords, addresses, credit card numbers, are all seen by the Instagram app." Yes, indeed. So in a statement, of course, Meta stated that injecting a tracking code obeyed users' preferences on whether or not they allowed apps to follow them, and it was only used to aggregate data before being applied for targeted advertising. Now, this is interesting because according to Krauss, this code injection was tracked, and he was able to look at it doing it, right? For normal browsers, his test code detected no changes, but for Facebook and Instagram, it finds up to 18 lines of code added by the app into the web page. So there you go, JavaScript injection and more from our friends at Facebook and Instagram. So they are tracking you, but apparently they're not listening to your microphone, but they're watching you as you cruise around the web thinking you're using your browser, but no, you're using theirs. Hey, stick around, CraigPeterson.com. Cell phone security is something I've talked about for a long time, and you guys know my basics here. If you've been a listener for really any length of time, when it comes to smartphones, we're going to get into this in more detail, particularly after this raid. Well, of course, everyone's heard, I'm sure, about the raid on Trump's property, Mar-a-Lago. There was something else that happened right about the same time, and that was Representative Scott Perry. Scott Perry was traveling with his in-laws, who are described as elderly. They were on vacation. He's a Republican representative in the House of Congress from Pennsylvania. And he told the Fox News people that 3 FBI agents approached him, issued him a warrant, and demanded he hand over his phone. He said they made no attempt to contact my lawyer, who would have made arrangements for them to have my phone if that was what they wanted. He says, I'm outraged, though not surprised, that the FBI, under the direction of Merrick Garland's DOJ, would seize the phone of a sitting member of Congress. My phone contains info about my legislative and political activities, personal, private discussions with my wife, family, constituents, and friends. None of this is the government's business. Now, that's really an interesting point, and it brings up the discussion about our smart devices. You know, what should we be doing with our phones? And what is it, frankly, that our phones have in them? Now, just think about that for a minute. Scott Perry, he mentioned that he had all kinds of records that were in that phone. You do too. You've got your contacts. Of course, the phone contains information about who you called, where you went, because it's got a GPS tracker. But even if GPS is turned off, it's still tracking which cell towers you've connected to. We've got all kinds of email in our phones, which are going to contain business documents, private documents, attorney-client privilege documents, all kinds of stuff there. And we have the Fourth Amendment, which protects the right of privacy against unreasonable searches and seizures by the government. Now, in this case, obviously, the government got a warrant. We could argue about, how legitimate is the warrant and should they have issued it, etc., right? That's not what I'm talking about. This is not a political show in reality. What we're talking about here is the technology. The technology we're using to store this information, this personal information. What should we be using? What shouldn't we be using? How should we use it, right? All of that sort of stuff. Well, okay, so we've established that there was not apparently a Fourth Amendment violation here. There might have been. We don't know. We may never know. It doesn't really matter. But if someone gets a hold of your smartphone or your tablet or your computer, what information does it have on there? And we also have a right under the Fifth Amendment against self-incrimination. So if someone's thumbing through our phone, what are they going to find? People plead the Fifth Amendment all of the time because they don't want to get trapped in one of these traps where maybe you don't remember the date right and all of a sudden you're in a perjury trap because you said something that wasn't true. Well, our memories aren't the best, particularly when we're on vacation. We've been drinking a little bit, right? So if someone finds your phone, opens it up, someone steals your phone and opens it up, someone gets a warrant for your phone and opens it up, what's in there? Now, some people have in the past said, okay, well, what I'll do is I'll just go ahead and I'll wipe my phone remotely. And they've done it, right? The police have had the phone in evidence in an evidence locker, and somebody remotely went ahead and wiped their phone. The police are onto that. And what the police have been doing more recently is they put it into a special bag that blocks any sort of signals coming in or out, as well as the room, right? It's kind of a Faraday cage anyways. And that way, bad guys, good guys, whoever, if their phones are stolen, they can't remotely wipe them, which is a good thing here, frankly. But what are we ultimately trying to protect from? That's the question, right? It's who's going to have your phone and what are you trying to protect it from? Personally, I'm not someone who truly trusts the government. I'm a firm believer in our Constitution and our Bill of Rights. Ultimately, governments become corrupt. It happens every time. And even if the whole government isn't corrupt, there's guaranteed to be people within the government, within the bureaucracy, the deep state, if you will, who are out there to get you, right? Makes sense to you? Makes sense to me. I don't know. But our phones, our smartphones, our computers have a lot of stuff in them. I've talked on the show before how you should not be taking them to China if you go to China because of the evil maid attack where they are grabbing your phones. They are duplicating them. Same thing with Russian travelers. Not as much as has been happening in China, but it's happened in Russia. Probably a lot now with the whole war thing, right? But you shouldn't be taking them because they can be duplicated, just like Scott Perry's phone was duplicated. Now, the FBI apparently said, well, we're not going to look through it. Well, why are you duplicating it then? And, maybe it's just to preserve evidence. I really don't know. But the bad guys can get at your phone. Employers, if they own your phone, can get at your phone. And they can get a lot of data out of that. So what do you do? Well, bottom line, if you are traveling internationally, you're going to want to make sure to wipe your phone and just bring along maybe a basic little flip phone, etc. Now, there's software that we use. For instance, we use 1Password and Duo in order to keep track of all of our stuff, right? Our personal information, and that's the two-factor authentication stuff that we use. And we can tell it, hey, we're traveling out of the country, and we will only need these passwords. And it goes ahead and wipes out the password database so that we're not carrying a whole bunch of stuff with us that might be compromised by a government agency, right? Within, what is it the U.S. says, 50 miles of the border, they can confiscate and examine anything that you have, even if you're not trying to cross the border. And they'll do that at airports. They'll do that at a whole bunch of places. And then you've got the employer side, and then you've got the bad guy side. Look at what happened to Khashoggi with the Saudis, right? Here he was, a journalist. We could argue that, I suppose. But he's a journalist. He is abducted, and he is murdered by the Saudis. They get their hands on the phone, and they decrypt the phone. This has happened, and it'll happen again. So Apple's done something here that I think is a good step in the right direction. Apple, of course, I've recommended for a long time, never, ever, 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 ever use Android. Okay, don't use it. Google's using it to track you. You're losing your privacy, and the security isn't very good, particularly if your phone's more than 3 years old. Apple has come up with this new lockdown mode on their phones. And the lockdown mode is meant for people who are really under thumb. People living in Russia or Ukraine or you name it, Iran, all of these countries that are really out to get their citizens. And it's coming out in iOS. You'll see it there. You probably don't want to use it as a regular person because it does block some of the things you can do, but it also locks it down against these Israeli-based companies that have been selling software and hardware to break into cell phones. So consider iPhones, and if you are one of these people who's at high risk, consider lockdown mode. I warned last week about using the Ring camera as well as Google's camera. We've got some more news about that today. I was right. A major breakthrough in nuclear fusion and a new toolkit released. Talk about it all now. Well, quite a time. You know, I remember when I first started doing the radio show 22 years ago now. It started right there, year 2000, Y2K. And I was wondering, you know, am I going to have enough stuff to talk about? And my wife, who was just the most amazing person, had been helping me, and we subscribed to a bunch of newspapers. Yeah, there used to be newspapers back then. And she went through and was clipping articles that we thought might be good, that people might want to hear about. And so she had all of these files, and we subscribed to like 4 or 5 different newspapers, including the trashy ones like USA Today, just so we knew what was going on out there. We had the Financial Times and the London Times and New York Times, and we got just files and files worth of stuff. And it didn't take us long to realize, hey, wait a minute, there is so much tech news out there and stuff to talk about that we don't have to worry about that. So we canceled our subscriptions to all of these different things. I have actually a subscription to the New York Times still, because they gave me $1 a week, which is not a bad deal for the online version, because the old gray lady still does have some good tech stories. Some of the other stuff obviously is a problem, but yeah, tech stories. Anyways, now we do a lot of this stuff online, the research, and I put it together and send it out in my newsletter every week. And man, did we have a lot of you guys reading it on Monday. It was the most read newsletter of mine, the Insider Show Notes newsletter, of any of them ever. It was really great. It was like I had almost a 50% open rate there within the first day. So that's cool. Thank you guys. And obviously you really value it, or you would not have opened that newsletter and clicked through. You see, what I do is, you probably know, I appear on radio stations all over the place. And I'm also, of course, have my own radio show here and elsewhere. And my podcasts, which are on every major podcast platform out there. And I've been doing this for so long. This week, what am I at here? Show number, I think it's like 1,700. I'm trying to remember. Weeks, okay? That's weeks of shows. And we have never hit the same stuff twice, which is really rather cool. One of the things I brought up, and this was in a recent show, is about these Ring cameras. And I warned everyone not to use Ring and went through the whys. So if you have my newsletter from a few weeks back, you can just probably search your email box for Ring camera, and you'll find links to a couple articles on that. And there's an article that just came out in the Record here talking about Ring, which was purchased by Amazon about 4 years ago. And Ring was looked at by this cybersecurity firm called Checkmarks. And they found that the Ring camera was leaking data like a sieve. Some of the web interface stuff, the videos were reachable online, and it was a real problem. So Ring is running the Android operating system, which isn't a bad operating system. It just, tends to not get updates. Something like a Ring camera, the advantage to it is it probably will get updates, and in fact, Amazon is pushing updates out to it because they were exposing data and camera recordings. So this particular article is not in your newsletter, so you can you don't look for this one there, but look for some of the other ones. And by the way, if you don't have my newsletter, if you don't get it, This is a free newsletter. I have my insider show notes that come out weekly, and then I also have some little trainings I do. I try and do it every week or two, just short ones. It takes you just a few minutes to read to try and bring you up to date. But overall, yeah, sometimes you can, sometimes I just can't get them out. But you do get my ISNs, because I send those also to the hosts of the radio stations where I appear, as well as the TV stations, to let them know what topics are kind of hot this week, because it's, I follow the tech quite closely for the show and the podcast and the appearances, but they don't follow technology that closely. So yeah, yet another reason to not use Ring and a reason to use Ring. I don't use them. I use at my house, at my office, we use some really good Cisco security systems that I really like and that do get updates. The things you want to avoid are these Chinese firms that have, the security cameras, one in particular that has about 90% of the market, which it's kind of scary, things we've seen there. All right, really, really, really good news. I have for a long time been talking about nuclear power. One of my sons is so totally into it. He was actually thinking about trying to get involved with the nuclear Navy program, which is a hard program to get into, and ultimately decided not to. But the nuclear power is back on the board. The European Union has come out and said, yeah, nuclear power is indeed clean. And green, in fact, they were saying, and they are turning back on some of these nuclear reactors. And they are green. But I want to talk about the new nuclear. We've got some amazing new nuclear technology today that is intrinsically safe, that uses basic physics to make sure that we're not going to get meltdowns, that we don't have all kinds of nuclear waste. It's just amazing what they've been able to do. And if you look at the failures of the various types of plants, in the past, the failures have been related typically to human error, but sometimes you get a stuck valve or a cracked pipe, etc. And in those cases, the humans might, again, react inappropriately and cause more problems, as in what happened there in northern Ukraine that we've all heard about many, many times. So what should we do? Well, the power everyone wants is either what's called cold fusion, which is making some progress, or the nuclear fusion as opposed to nuclear fission. Fission's what we've been using now for, going on 80 years. And it's what goes into nuclear bombs, but it's also what's used at pretty much every nuclear plant out there. And there's a new company that just got approval. When I say new, I mean relatively. It took them 6 years to get the approval from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to put this new nuclear power plant into production. And it is really innovative. So they're using the same basic fission technology that we've used for a long time, but a couple of big differences. One, it's considered to be safe, and two, these nuclear plants are small. They are made in a factory where everything can be monitored closely, and they can easily put together errata. Hey, you need to do this upgrade, that upgrade. And the nuclear plant is shipped out to location. Now, consider how we have been doing it in the past, where we build a building, we put all the stuff in, everything is made from scratch. We have to get the guys and gals doing the welds and moving the stuff around, and every plant is different, substantially different in some regards. So with this new approved nuclear company, everything's exactly the same. They're made in a factory. So that's a huge, huge win to get that approved. But here's the really good news. The power of the sun In the sun and other stars, you've got heavy hydrogen atoms that are colliding with so much force that they actually fuse together to make a helium atom. And just like fission releases a lot of energy by splitting the atom, that joining, creating this new atom also releases large amounts of electricity, or energy, I should say, as a byproduct. And that's what's happening in the stars out there, including our sun. Well, we had a major breakthrough in nuclear fusion. It was about a year ago, and it was at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory out in California. And this is their national ignition facility. And they have been trying all kinds of ways to make this work. And we've had fusion for quite a while, but the problem is it takes more energy for these fusion reactors to get online and stay online than they produce. 1 year later, now we're looking at 3 peer-reviewed papers that say, yes, indeed, they were able to ignite the hydrogen plasma. For the first time, we have a fusion reaction that is self-sustaining. The fusions themselves are producing enough power to maintain the temperature, the control systems, etc., without any external heating. So this is really, really good news. Of course, it's going to have to be scaled, and a bunch of things are going to have to happen. But if they can do this, if they can do the fusion reactor, or even some of these others that have just been approved here, which is more of a standard type of reactor, you can hook these up to your coal power plants that already have all the electrical infrastructure there. They already have all the power lines coming in, the transformers that are needed, the steam plants that can take the heat and convert that heat into electricity. All of that stuff is already there. Just replace the coal burning with either, hopefully, this fusion. Hopefully they can scale this, but this is really good news. Or one of these small nuclear power plants that is made in a factory and shipped out. Wow, what good news. Hey, visit me online. Make sure you get my newsletters. CraigPeterson.com/subscribe. Go there now.